Evelyn Marsh walked it slow, head down, her boots leaving faint prints on the frozen mud. Every window she passed carried a shadow, someone peering just enough to remind her she didn't belong there anymore. She had stopped flinching weeks ago. Now she just listened to the sound her skirt made brushing against itself, steady as a clock ticking through a long winter. At the mercantile, she placed 2 coins on the counter. "I need flour." "Just a little. Enough for 3 loaves." Mr. Tate didn't even look up from his ledger. "You still owe me from last month, Miss Marsh." She swallowed. "I'll bring payment after next week. I've got work lined up," he snorted. "Work? Ain't nobody hiring school teachers these days. Not ones with your reputation." The words slid across the room like a slap. The 2 men by the stove went quiet. Evelyn felt their eyes on her, heavy as coal dust. She gathered the coins, fingers trembling more from humiliation than cold, and turned to leave. That's when she saw him. Cale Ryder leaned against the doorway, arms folded, coat dusted with frost. He wasn't smirking like the others. His eyes, gray as riverstone, just watched, calm, measuring. She didn't wait to see more. She stepped past him, chin lifted, the sting in her throat turning to iron. Outside, the wind howled through the hitching posts, tossing her shawl loose. She clutched it tighter, muttering, "Don't look back." But she did, just once, and saw the cowboy still standing there, gaze following her, not cruel, not kind. Just curious. That night, Evelyn sat by her cold stove, her hands raw from trying to split kindling with a dull hatchet. The room smelled of iron and damp wood. She was used to hunger now, but not to the ache that came from being unseen. She thought about what the men said. Reputation. As if helping a hungry child had made her wicked. As if compassion were a sin. When she heard the knock, she nearly didn't answer. It came again, steady. She opened the door to find Cale Ryder holding a sack. "Your chimney's smoking wrong," he said. "You'll choke yourself out before sunrise." "I'll manage," she replied, voice flat. "Don't look like it." He stepped inside before she could protest, setting the sack by the stove. "Damp wood. You need dry pine." "I cut extra this morning." She stared at him, mud on his boots, frost melting in his hair. "Why?" he shrugged. "You said you got work lined up. Figure you'll need to live long enough to do it." Something in his tone wasn't pity. It was matter of fact, like he'd offered her nothing more than truth. She didn't know what to do with that. He adjusted the flue, coaxed the fire alive, then looked up at her. "You ain't got to thank me." "I wasn't going to," she said, then instantly regretted the sharpness. He smiled just a little. "Good. I don't like fancy words anyway." They stood in the flickering light, 2 people with too much silence between them. The fire crackled, warming her cheeks. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. When he turned to go, she spoke without thinking. "I'm not what you wanted, Mr. Ryder. Folks said you needed a proper hand. Someone useful." He paused at the doorway, his shadow stretching across her floor. "Maybe. But sometimes what a man wants and what he needs ain't the same thing." The door shut softly, leaving only the sound of the wind and the fire's low hum. Evelyn sat down by the stove, staring at the place where he'd stood. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or fear that made her heart thump so hard. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, quiet, like the world was giving her one more chance to stay warm. The snow hadn't stopped for 2 days. It came in fine, dry sheets, quiet as ash falling from an old fire. Evelyn Marsh kept the stove burning with what little wood she had left, counting the sticks like prayers. By morning, her breath fogged in the air. The loaf she'd baked had gone hard overnight, and the edges of the window were rimmed in white. When she opened the door, a drift spilled inside, and there, half buried in snow, was another small pile of wood, no note. Just the neat cut of Cale Ryder's axe. She stared for a long time before bringing the wood in. "You shouldn't have," she muttered under her breath, though she knew he couldn't hear. Pride was a stubborn thing. It could starve a woman faster than winter ever could. By noon, she heard the crunch of hooves outside. Cale's voice carried through the wind. "You still alive in there?" Evelyn pulled the door open, her shawl wrapped tight. "Barely," she said, but her eyes softened, despite herself. He dismounted, brushing the snow off his hat. "Fence up by the north ridge is near gone. You good with a hammer?" "I've used worse." "Good," he said simply. I'll trade you a roof and supper for 2 good days' work. You fix what you can. No charity, just trade. That word, trade, landed soft in her chest. It was the only kind of mercy she could stand. His ranch sat in a small hollow east of town, a place the wind forgot. The cabin was sturdy but plain, just like him. When she stepped inside, the smell of leather, pine, and old smoke wrapped around her like a coat. Cale tossed her a dry pair of gloves. You'll freeze with those rags you got. Try these. They're too big, she said. He shrugged. So's this land. Don't mean it won't hold you. The man didn't say much after that. They worked side by side, hammering new boards into place where the storm had torn the fencing down. His hands were steady, movements quiet and sure. Evelyn's fingers ached, but there was a rhythm to it. Strike, breathe, strike. Sometimes he'd glance at her like he wanted to say something, then just chew the inside of his cheek instead. She understood. Words weren't easy for people who'd lost too much. When the sun started to sink, the valley filled with rose-colored light. He wiped his brow with his sleeve and nodded toward the cabin. You look half dead. Come on, I'll heat some stew. She hesitated. You don't owe me supper. I don't owe you not freezing either, he said, and opened the door for her. Inside, the firelight made the room glow gold. The table was rough-hewn, the kettle blackened from use. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and set one in front of her. Evelyn waited until he sat down. You really mean to hire me? He took a slow sip before answering. I mean to let you earn your keep if that's what you need. And what do you need, Mr. Ryder? He looked at her then, longer than was proper. Someone who doesn't lie about how hard life is. The answer hung in the air, simple and true. For the first time, she smiled. Not wide, just enough to crease the corner of her mouth. Well, she said, I'm not much for lying. That's fine, he said, setting his bowl down. I need honest, not fancy. The fire popped, and they both looked at it, like the flames might explain what neither dared say aloud. Outside, the storm had stilled. The wind was gone. Only the steady beat of snow dripping from the roof marked time between them. Evelyn leaned back, feeling the ache in her hands, the quiet warmth in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was shelter. And for a woman who'd had to beg the world for every scrap of kindness, that was enough to make her stay. By early spring, the snow had melted into mud, and the sound of dripping water filled the valley. Evelyn Marsh stood outside Cale Ryder's cabin, sleeves rolled up, mending a fence post while the morning sun caught on her hair. The air smelled of pine pitch and thawing earth. Inside, Cale watched her through the window for a moment before turning back to his coffee. He didn't mean to stare. It was just strange seeing life move quietly where silence used to be. She worked steady, never complained, never asked for more than she needed. A week had turned into 2, then a month. She still called him Mr. Ryder, though he'd told her twice to drop the Mr. Old habits die harder than hunger. That afternoon she came in with her hands raw and her hair damp from mist. He'd left a kettle warming on the stove. You drink coffee, Miss Marsh? He asked. Only when there's someone else to share it, she said, hanging her shawl by the door. He poured 2 tin cups and set one across the table. You fixed that south gate? Mostly. It still leans like an old drunk, but it'll hold. He chuckled low, the kind of sound she hadn't heard from him before. It surprised her enough to smile back. That's high praise, he said. It's honest, she replied, echoing his words from weeks ago. The quiet that followed wasn't the old kind, the heavy one filled with things unsaid. This one was easier, soft around the edges like the space between 2 breaths. In the evenings, she'd sit by the fire with needle and thread, patching worn shirts he was too proud to replace. Sometimes he'd tell her about the horses he used to break for the army, or the year the river froze solid and he lost half his cattle. When she asked about his wife, he didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, jaw tight. She was sick a long time, he finally said. Couldn't fix that with any amount of work. Evelyn nodded. Some things can't be fixed. Only carried. Her voice didn't shake, but he could hear the truth in it, the kind that comes from living it yourself. He turned then, really looking at her. That what you've been doing? Carrying? She smiled faintly, eyes down on the thread. What else is there to do? Something in him loosened, a knot he hadn't known he'd tied. A few nights later, a storm rolled in sudden from the west. The wind slammed the shutters and rain hammered the roof. Evelyn rose to check the latch when lightning flashed, and the whole place shuddered. "Stay put," Cale said, stepping to the door. "You'll get soaked." He waved her off, pulling on his coat. "Better me than the horses? They spook easy in thunder." She followed him halfway to the barn, her skirts whipping in the wind. When he turned and saw her, rain plastering her hair to her face, he frowned, but not with anger. "You just can't let a man do a fool thing alone, can you?" She laughed, the sound nearly lost in the storm. "Not when there's work to do." They got the horses settled, soaked to the bone, then ran back to the cabin, breathless and dripping. Inside, she wrung out her shawl near the fire while he stoked the flames. "Reckon we survived," he said. "For now," she answered with a grin that surprised them both. Cale watched the firelight play on her face. Soft, alive, unguarded. He didn't say a word, but in that quiet, something shifted. The space between them felt smaller. Not love yet, maybe not even hope, but trust, simple and steady as the rain easing outside. He poured 2 mugs of hot water from the kettle, and when she took hers, their fingers brushed. It wasn't an accident. For the first time since the world had turned against her, Evelyn didn't feel like someone surviving. She felt like someone seen, and as the storm faded into a gentle drip from the eaves, Cale thought maybe that was enough, for now. By early summer, the valley had turned green again. The cottonwoods whispered with wind and wildflowers crept back along the fence line. Evelyn Marsh had begun to hum when she worked, quietly, almost without knowing. Cale Ryder noticed it but never said a word. He just listened, like a man afraid that naming peace might scare it off. They had fallen into a rhythm, her tending the garden, him mending tack, the silence between them no longer heavy but full. Some evenings they'd eat by the window and talk about small things. A hawk's flight, the stubborn mule, how the bread actually rose this time. Simple talk that made the cabin feel alive again, but good things don't stay hidden long in a town like Eagle's Rest. The first whisper came from the mercantile. A woman from church saw Evelyn riding into town on Cale's wagon and told it like she'd seen scandal itself. By the time the story reached the saloon, it had grown legs. Cale Ryder took that schoolteacher in, they said. She's living under his roof. When Evelyn walked into the store a few days later, the room went quiet. Mr. Tate pretended to be busy stacking sugar sacks. The women by the counter stopped talking mid-sentence. "Morning," she said, voice calm. "Need flour and salt." Mr. Tate weighed the flour in silence, his jaw tight. "He's paying for this, I suppose." Her cheeks burned. "I earn my keep same as any man." A low chuckle came from somewhere in the back. "Ain't what folks been saying." She didn't answer. Just gathered her parcels and left, every step feeling heavier than the last. Outside, the sun was too bright. The air too sharp. The same road that once felt freeing now felt like a gauntlet. That evening, Cale found her sitting on the porch staring at nothing. "Town give you a hard time?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look at him. "They've been giving me a hard time since I got here. Now they've decided to give you one too." He leaned against the post beside her. "Let 'em talk. It's easy to say that when it's not your name being dragged through the dirt." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't care what they think." She turned to him, eyes sharp. "Then maybe you should, because they think I'm something I'm not, and your silence makes them right." The words hit him harder than she knew. Cale wasn't a man who fought with words. He fought with his back, his hands, his work. But standing there, seeing the pain in her face, he realized his silence wasn't kindness, it was cowardice. Still, all he managed to say was, "It'll blow over." Evelyn laughed, soft and bitter. "No, it won't, not here. Not for a woman like me." She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. "You wanted help, not me. Don't worry, you'll still get the fences fixed before harvest." Then she went inside and closed the door. Cale stayed on the porch long after dark, listening to the crickets start up in the grass. The words looped in his head. You wanted help, not me. He hadn't meant it that way. He didn't even know how to say what he did mean, that her presence had steadied him, made the world make sense again. But words had never been his trade. Inside, he heard the faint creak of her bed and the sigh of the wind through the window. He thought about knocking, about saying something, anything. But instead, he sat down on the steps, elbows on his knees, eyes on the moon. Sometimes silence is a man's shield. Sometimes it's his biggest sin. And by morning, Evelyn Marsh was gone. The morning Evelyn Marsh left, the light came thin and gray. Cale Ryder sat by the cold stove, boots unpolished, coffee untouched. Her shawl was still hanging by the door. He'd reached for it twice before realizing she hadn't forgotten it. She'd left it on purpose. A piece of warmth she didn't want to owe him. He spent the first day working the fences harder than needed. The second, he tried not to listen for her footsteps. By the third, the silence in the cabin felt like a punishment. People in town stopped him when he came in for supplies. "Heard she's gone," they said. Probably found another man to take pity. He didn't answer. He just set his money down, same as always. But that night, under the stars, he realized something had shifted. He'd been part of their silence too long. 3 days later, the town gathered in the square for the summer auction. Farmers selling tools, traders calling out prices, the same laughter that had once humiliated her echoing through the air. Evelyn stood at the edge of the crowd, face pale but steady. She had come to collect her pay for the work she'd done. Nothing more, she told herself. She wanted to leave with what little dignity she had left. Then she saw him. Cale Ryder stepped onto the wooden platform beside the auctioneer, his hat in hand. The chatter died down. He wasn't a man who spoke in front of people. Everyone knew that. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping the crowd. "Most of you know me," he began. "You've known me near 15 years. You've also been talking plenty about the woman who worked my land," someone in the crowd muttered. Cale's voice grew firmer. "You say she came begging. You're wrong. She came working. And she worked harder than any man I've hired." A few faces turned away. The blacksmith coughed into his hand. Cale went on. "You call her shameless for staying under my roof. Funny thing, none of you offered her your own when she was freezing." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was heavy waiting. Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to walk away, but her feet wouldn't move. Cale looked toward her then, not the crowd. Just her. "You were right," he said, voice steady. "You're not what I wanted. You're what I hoped for." It wasn't loud, but it carried, like a bell in clear air. Evelyn felt something inside her finally exhale. The gossip, the stares, the shame, it all fell quiet. She didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so she just stood there, hands trembling, heart hammering like a runaway colt. After the crowd drifted off, she found him by his wagon, tying down a crate of seed. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He didn't look up. "I know. It'll just give them more to talk about." He smiled faintly. "Let 'em. I'm done keeping quiet for cowards." For a long time, neither spoke. The breeze lifted dust along the road, and the world seemed to pause between one heartbeat and the next. Finally, he said, "You heading somewhere?" "I thought I might," she said. "Didn't decide which way yet." "Well," he said, tightening the last rope, "I could use another pair of honest hands. Only if you're willing." Her eyes met his, tired, wary, but warmer than they'd been in months. "You sure you're not after fancy this time?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Honest'll do." Evelyn looked out at the valley, golden under the late sun. The same road that had once led her away from everything now looked like a path back to something she hadn't dared want. Peace. She climbed up into the wagon beside him. No words, no promises. Just the creak of wheels and the smell of warm earth. As they rode toward the hills, the last light of day spilled across the land like a benediction. Cale glanced at her, then back to the road. "You're home now," he said quietly. And for the first time in a long, hard life, she believed him.